Merry Christmas and welcome to the fourth day of Christmas. Let's get started.
Hey, we're Drew and Katie Taylor with Catholic Link, bringing you daily reflections on the 12 days of Christmas to help you live out the season.
So, if you want to keep up to date on all of these reflections, go ahead and subscribe. Please leave a comment on how you're celebrating the 12 days, how you're using these. We really want to build a community because we're stuck in isolation. We are currently quarantined.
Yep.
So, please join us and go ahead and like and share this video if you get value out of it. The fourth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me
4 calling birds,
which are 4 voices calling out the 4 major prophets in the Old Testament, which are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel for the length of their books.
Not for how important they are.
I know, it's so disappointing. Major just seems majorly important, but still some really good things there to sit with. And so if you have time to pray in one of those 4 books today, great way to spend the day. The other 4 voices calling out are the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And because the gospel really is just the good news. So these are people proclaiming the good news of Christ.
Because he came. It's Christmas. Jesus has been born. And he dies and he rises for us.
Yep.
All good news.
Yes.
The other thing that we can look at today are the 4 mysteries or sets of mysteries of the Rosary. Not traditional because they weren't around in the 1700s when the song was written, but...
Were the mysteries of the Rosary not at all?
Well, okay, so there was the sorrowful, the glorious, and the joyful.
Yes.
But in 2002, Pope John Paul II declared the luminous mysteries to be part of the Universal Church's small t tradition of the Rosary.
So now we have 4 sets.
So go ahead and check out our video on how to pray with those, which we'll link above. Today's feast day is...
the Feast of the Holy Innocents.
Such a hard one, especially at Christmas when we're celebrating an infant, the baby Jesus. It's really hard as a mom. So the Holy Innocents are the first people to die for our faith. They are the children that King Harold ordered to be killed in trying to kill baby Jesus, which he did not succeed at. But as a result, a lot of young boys did have to die, a lot of young children. So I think today really helps look at suffering that maybe seems pointless, at why this happens.
And there's a lot of suffering that seems pointless in our world right now, for sure.
Absolutely. Like us being sick.
Yep.
But I think it's also a time to look at Christ, to look at the example that he gives us, that suffering is the path to sanctity, that it does have a purpose. It does have a why.
And we're really called as Christians to wrestle with this idea of suffering. I think at one point in your life, you have to grapple with why is there suffering? And it's important to realize that suffering, that idea is not separated from the Christian faith. Like God sent his only son to suffer and die for us. In a true act of agape or love. And when you love someone like that, you're willing to suffer for their good.
Absolutely. St. John of the Cross talks about this idea that we've actually missed out on a lot of saints because we turn away from suffering. We don't want to embrace it and we don't want it to allow our sanctification. And so God goes, well, you aren't willing to go here. You aren't willing to grow in this way. You aren't willing to give up these things that cause instant pleasure for the betterment of your soul.
For all the men out there who have not done Exodus 90, you should do it. Embrace the suffering.
But with that, we can also cause our own suffering.
Yeah, it's kind of a different type of suffering where oftentimes in our sin, God allows us to suffer really as a result or consequence of our own sin. He kind of just allows us to, like, you chose to do this, so.
Yeah, because the goal of suffering is that we unite it to Christ, that we bring it to him, that we allow it to lead to the redemption of our own souls and those around us. But when we are in sin, a good definition of sin is just a broken relationship. We've chosen to not do what God has asked us to do. So we've hurt our relationship. If Drew looks at me and says, Katie, can you do X, Y, and Z? And I say no, and they are just requests, they're just things that he's asking for, it's going to hurt our relationship when I again and again am like, not doing it for you, not interested in helping you in that way, in loving you in that way, and sacrificing in that way for you. And so just in that element, then I'm not able to bring all of the other gifts that I have given as a way to redeem our relationship, as a way to grow in our relationship.
So in a similar way, where if we suffer through our own sins, it's not necessarily sanctifying or redempting, but when we're in a state of grace, now that suffering can be united to God on the cross through redemptive suffering. And now that can be a true act where we're offering up that suffering for our own sanctification and for the sanctification of others, which is a beautiful gift that God gives us.
And I think in the midst of suffering, another important element to look at is God doesn't look at us and he doesn't go, hey, get it together. Like, figure it out and start rejoicing, because even though this is hard, you should know that I've come into the world and everything is perfect and wonderful and
Just
great.
suck it up.
Just suck it up. That's not the way that God treats us. And I think a great passage to look at is John's Gospel, chapter 11. Shocker that I love John. Ideally, verses 33 through 35, when we look at the death of Lazarus. Mary is sitting there and she's weeping, and those around her. And it says that Jesus is moved to weep, that he is troubled. And so he turns and he sits down beside Mary, besides those who are in sorrow, and he weeps. And to allow Jesus to sit beside you. And so if you feel like crying and not being okay today, to allow Jesus to just hold you and to sit beside you in that emotion and that realness, and know, he knew in that moment the glory that awaited Lazarus in heaven, that he was going to raise him very shortly and bring glory through this situation. But he doesn't force Mary to get there instantaneously. He allows the initial pain to ultimately lead to even further glory. So just know that he longs to console you, that he longs to love you. And with that, I think it's important to look at our own stories.
Yeah, it's really important for us to take a look at the suffering that we've had in our life and how God has used that for our own sanctification, for our own testimony, right? Where we were before in our suffering and how God has brought us through that. And now how our life has changed through this relationship with God.
And that's called our testimony. And I think one of my favorite verses on this is 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. And it states this idea that, but even if you should suffer for righteousness, blessed are you. And he goes on to talk about, do not be afraid or terrified, that we should allow this to sanctify our hearts and always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks you for the reason for your hope and joy, and to give it in gentleness and kindness and reverence. And so this idea of today to sit with our own story, see where Jesus, even when we didn't feel it, was sitting down beside us and weeping on our behalf, where he was using that horrendous event, something like the Holy Innocents, to bring us to glory, to bring us to a newness.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the traditions for today. The first one with the 4 calling birds is going to be calling, or things that we can do with our phone.
So some ideas are, you can buy yourself a new case or order one as a gift for someone. For me, we're just going to schedule an appointment at the Apple Care when we're out of quarantine.
Because your screen is totally cracked.
It happens a lot. Apple Care is really important in my life. And then we can just change out the photo, just free and easy, the background, to something like the Holy Spirit or to Jesus, to remind us to proclaim the good news when we answer our phone, to speak words of life into and whoever's on the other side of that phone, that they too are a child of God.
The other thing you could do is download an app, maybe Hallow or one of the prayer apps. So now we can use our phone as a method for our own sanctification.
Yeah, and
growing
like
closer.
a good holy book is something I really enjoy in my Kindle app as well. The other things that we can do today. So the 4 calling birds can be our calling cards or our thank you notes.
Yeah, which we're terrible at.
Yes, but we need to cultivate gratitude and teach that to our children. So we're going to work really hard to do that on the 4th day of Christmas and get them in the mail now. And then the other things that we can do are just sit over our testimony today and really work on gratitude. So we're praying for you, and God bless.